Hey guys, ever wondered what a day that feels like a hamster wheel stuck in a swamp looks like? Before we dive in, smash that like button if you love watching paint dry in theory, and drop a comment describing your own Thursday nightmare. Your stories fuel the absurdity. Dim the lights, pour a coffee that might as well be motor oil, and picture yourself waking up to the same cracked rooster alarm that the town's only rooster named Gregory crows at 6:03 a.m. every single day, because apparently time here is on a permanent snooze. You shuffle to the kitchen. The air smells like stale bacon and exhaust from the rusted tractor outside, while the hum of the old diner's neon sign flickers like a dying firefly, reminding you that excitement is measured in minutes between grocery deliveries. As you step onto the cracked sidewalk, the cobblestones crunch under your feet like overcooked cereal, and you realize the most thrilling plot twist is whether Mrs. Patel will finally forget to return your library book. Yes, that's the drama, so stick around, because we're about to unpack why this relentless ordinary is actually a secret masterpiece. And trust me, you'll never look at a boring Tuesday the same way again. The first light draped Willow Creek like a lazy blanket, amber rays slipping through the cracked shutters of the town hall. A rooster, half as enthusiastic as a teenager waking for a Saturday morning cartoon, crowed once before resigning to a nap. The cobblestones still wore the night's dew, glistening like a spilled bottle of cheap perfume. Street lamps flickered off one by one, their glow fading into the ordinary hum of a town that never aimed for drama. At the crack of dawn, Elsie swung open the flour-dusted door of the Willow Bakehouse, her apron smelling of butter and yesterday's gossip. She kneaded dough with the vigor of a blacksmith forging a sword, except her weapon was a wooden spoon, and her battlefield a tiny kitchen. The ovens breathed out a warm, yeasty haze that curled around passers-by like an eager hug from a long-lost aunt. A fresh batch of croissants emerged, golden and flaky, daring anyone to resist their buttery whisper. Just as the croissants cooled, the postmaster, Mr. Finch, marched down Main Street with a satchel bulging like an overpacked superhero cape. He handed Mrs. Dobbins a letter sealed with a heart-shaped sticker, which she opened with the reverence of unwrapping a treasure from a video game loot chest. In between, he tossed out junk mail coupon flyers for a nearby gym promising abs faster than a TikTok trend, causing a collective eye roll that could have powered a wind turbine. Yet each envelope, whether bill or birthday card, stitched the town together with ink-stained threads. The townsfolk shuffled past each other, nodding with the politeness of characters in a period drama who never quite say hello out loud. Old Mr. Whittaker tipped his hat to the teenage barista who was balancing a latte and a smartphone, both of which threatened to spill on his polished shoes. Children giggled, chasing after a stray dog that smelled like old socks and optimism, while Mrs. Larkin whispered a prayer for the parking lot, which was as full as a medieval market square. Even the stray cat perched atop the water tower, watching the choreography like a bored narrator of a sitcom. And somewhere, a lone guitar strummed a tune that sounded suspiciously like the opening riff of Stairway to Heaven. But everyone pretended they'd never heard it before. By mid-morning, Willow Creek settled into a rhythm as predictable as a metronome in a classroom. Each tick-a-clink of a coffee mug, or the distant hum of a tractor. The scent of fresh pastry mingled with the earthy perfume of dew-soaked fields, creating a cocktail that was half comfort and half complacency. The sun climbs higher, spilling gold onto the storefronts, while the townspeople continued their polite nods, as if rehearsing a silent play that never needed an audience. In that ordinary chorus, there was no heroics, no plot twists, just the quiet confidence that even the most mundane day can feel like a small, shared epic. On a Tuesday that smelled like yesterday's burnt toast, Mrs. Patel discovered her grocery list had vanished like a trick card in a magician's sleeve. She stared at the empty scrap of notebook, the ink smudged by a stray coffee droplet, and decided a stroll through the one street market was her only recourse. The cobblestones glistened with a thin film of morning dew, each step sending up a puff of chilled mist that tickled her nose. Passers-by waved half-heartedly, their conversations a low hum of barter and gossip, while the town's ancient clock tower ticked in the distance like a lazy metronome. With a sigh that could have powered a windmill, she set off, listless but determined. First stop was the spice stall, a kaleidoscope of cumin, turmeric, and a stray whiff of burnt cardboard that made her eyes water. The awning, however, hung limp, and the shutters were bolted shut, a sign proclaiming closed for restocking in shaky chalk. Mrs. Patel knocked politely, only to be met with the echo of an empty storefront and a stray pigeon that pooped on her shoe, nature's way of saying, "Not today." She shrugged, slipped the damp shoe into her bag, and muttered a joke about the stall being on an extended coffee break. The scent of cloves lingered in the air, teasing her appetite like a mischievous ghost. Undeterred, she drifted to the bakery, where the aroma of fresh rye and melted butter usually beckoned the town's early birds. The old cash register, a clunky wooden beast with a squeaky drawer, had given up its final beep, its display stuck on 0, like a stubborn teenager refusing to grow up. The baker, a burly man with flour-dusted elbows, waved a spatula in resignation and offered her a warm scone as consolation. Mrs. Patel laughed, noting that the register was as broken as the plot of a low-budget superhero movie, except nobody got a cape. She tucked the scone into her bag, its buttery crumble a small triumph against mechanical failure. As she turned the corner, a sudden drizzle arrived, dribbling down like someone had tipped a giant teacup over the town square. The rain slapped the cobbles, turning the market into a slip and slide, and the ancient clock tower, usually punctual as a Swiss watch, sputtered. Its hands stuck at 9:13, as if the heavens were pausing for a dramatic pause. Umbrella vendors scrambled, their parasols popping open like startled crabs, while Mrs. Patel huddled under a wilted newspaper that smelled of ink and old jokes. Droplets pattered on the tin roof of the post office, making a rhythm that reminded her of a lullaby gone wrong. She shuffled forward, shoes squelching, humming a tune from a 90s sitcom that somehow made the rain feel less like a curse. Finally, she reached the tiny grocer's corner where the owner, a wiry man with a grin wider than the Mississippi, handed her a sack of beans without ever seeing the vanished list. He chuckled, saying, "We'll just pretend you ordered the invisible groceries free of charge." Mrs. Patel laughed louder than the market's stray dog, whose fur smelled of mud and ambition. She walked home, the sky clearing to reveal a stubborn sun that looked like a celebrity cameo, bright, slightly overcooked, and entirely out of place. The sack clinked against her hip, a metallic reminder that even the most mundane day can end with a tiny, crunchy victory. And as the town clock finally ticked forward, the whole street seemed to sigh in relief, as if they'd all just survived a sitcom episode titled The Lost Shopping List. The sun draped its heavy blanket over the town square, turning the cobblestones into a slow cooking griddle. Heat rose in shimmering waves that made the air taste like melted chewing gum left on a dashboard. Old men in folding chairs sweated into their shirts, while the town clock ticked louder than a metronome in a marching band. A stray breeze fluttered a lone newspaper, but even it seemed reluctant to disturb the stillness. In that sweltering pause, the whole place felt like a paused frame in an old Western film. At the far end of the square, a ragtag youth soccer match sputtered to a halt when a buzzing cloud of bees burst from a busted beehive. The boys froze, eyes bulging like cartoon characters, as the insects swarmed around the makeshift goalpost. One kid swore he heard the bees chanting the theme from B-Movie, while another jabbed his shoe into the dirt, hoping to scare them away. The referee, an over-enthusiastic retired mail carrier, raised his whistle in vain, the sound swallowed by the relentless hum. Finally, the swarm drifted off, leaving a lingering scent of honey and a chorus of muttered, "Not again," from the sidelines. Inside the town library, the old oak desk creaked under the weight of overdue novels that smelled faintly of mildew and stale coffee. Perched atop the piled tomes, Miss Ellsworth's cat, Sir Whiskerson, lounged like a furry monarch, his tail flicking with regal indifference. He pounced onto a stack of mystery books, sending a cloud of dust into the air that made the librarian sneeze like a malfunctioning trumpet. As patrons whispered about late fees, Sir Whiskerson yawned, exposing a pink tongue that seemed to say, "I'm the only one actually checking these out." The cat's nonchalance turned the quiet reading room into a tiny stage for absurd drama. Just as the librarian shushed the murmuring crowd, the overhead lights began to flicker, casting the square into a strobe-lit nightmare reminiscent of an 80s dance club gone wrong. The town's aging power lines sighed and popped, each buzz like an angry wasp threatening to sting the whole block. Residents exchanged whispered complaints, their voices low enough to avoid waking the cat, but loud enough to rival a secret council of conspirators. Mrs. Delgado muttered that the town council's budget meetings were probably as useful as a screen door on a submarine. Even the mayor, perched on a bench, pretended his old leather hat was a crown, though the hat's brim drooped like a wilted lettuce leaf. By late afternoon, the heat finally eased, but not before the town square earned a new nickname. The Great Pause, a phrase that would echo through the diner's jukebox forever. Children laughed, swapping tales of the bee invasion as if it were a blockbuster sci-fi sequel, while the librarian rescued Sir Whiskerson from the overdue pile and declared him the most punctual patron. The flickering lights settled into a steady hum, and the town sighed relief, though some swear they still hear a distant buzz in their dreams. As the sun sank, casting amber shadows, the town's humdrum day felt like a low-budget sitcom episode, mundane, messy, and oddly comforting. In the end, even the most ordinary day turned into a story worth retelling at the next town meeting, complete with exaggerated hand gestures and a wink to anyone who'd listen. On a Tuesday that smelled of freshly mowed hay and the faint whiff of diesel, Main Street in Willowbrook trudged along like a forgotten chapter of a history book. The sun hung low, casting amber shadows over the brick storefronts that had survived 2 world wars and 3 county fairs. Suddenly, a hulking delivery truck, its back doors yawning open like a gaping maw, skidded into the lane, its cargo of cardboard boxes spilling onto the cobblestones. The townsfolk paused, coffee cups clinking, as the truck's horn blared a discordant salute to the everyday Mayor Whittaker, a man who once tried to reenact a Churchill speech at the high school talent show, sprinted to the scene with the urgency of a cat chasing a laser pointer. He surveyed the blockage, scratched his chin, and declared, "If we can't move the truck, we'll move the parade." With a flourish, he rallied the fire engine, its red paint glistening like a freshly minted penny, and a ragtag marching band composed entirely of retirees who still remembered the swing era. The mayor's voice carried over the clatter, turning bureaucratic crisis into a spontaneous celebration of small-town resilience. The fire engine thundered down the street, its siren wailing like a jazz trumpet on a Saturday night, while the retirees tapped their canes in perfect time, their uniforms a patchwork of faded badges and nostalgia. Elsie's Bakery, perched at the corner, flung out leftover pastries, croissants still warm, cinnamon rolls oozing sugar into the wind, creating a sugary cloud that made the air taste like childhood and gumdrop dreams. The crowd's murmurs rose to a cacophony of laughter, shouted greetings, and the occasional squeal of a dog startled by the marching shoes. Everywhere, the scent of diesel mingled with butter, while dust rose in swirling ribbons, catching the sunlight like glittering confetti. Spectators leaned over railings, their faces painted with the same mix of bewilderment and delight you might see on a reality TV cooking showdown. Think MasterChef meets a county fair. Mrs. Patel, clutching her grandson's hand, shouted, "This is better than the fireworks on the 4th of July." A teenage boy live-streamed the chaos, dubbing it the Great Willowbrook Shuffle, his commentary peppered with memes about unexpected plot twists. The retirees, meanwhile, swapped stories about the town's first electric street lamp, their chuckles punctuating the engine's roar like percussion in a marching symphony. When the fire engine finally coughed to a stop at the town square, the truck remained stubbornly lodged, its cargo now a tangled sculpture of cardboard and pastries. Mayor Whittaker tipped his hat, declaring the day a historic footnote. We may not have cleared the road, but we cleared the boredom. The townspeople dispersed, sticky fingers and smiling faces, the aroma of cinnamon lingering like a sweet afterglow. And as night fell, the streetlights flickered on, casting long shadows over the scene. An ordinary day transformed into a legend that would be retold with a wink at every future town meeting. As the amber sun slipped behind the hills, the rusted delivery truck finally shivered free from the last barricade, its brakes squealing like an old radio that had just found its station. The parade's final drum roll faded into the evening, leaving only the faint shuffling of marching boots on cracked pavement. Townsfolk, still clutching half-eaten funnel cakes, exchanged weary glances that whispered, "We survived another Saturday." A stray dog barked at a tumbleweed, momentarily stealing the spotlight from the mayor's ceremonial hat. The The sky deepened into a bruised violet, promising a night of ordinary miracles. Mrs. Whittaker, the bakery's unofficial queen of gossip, tossed the leftover cinnamon rolls into the wind, letting their sugary scent mingle with the earthy perfume of fresh rain. The town's lone street lamp flickered on, casting a trembling amber pool that made the puddles look like miniature moons. Somewhere in the distance, a teenager laughed at a meme on his phone, the glow of the screen painting his face, a comic book yellow. The air tasted of diesel and apple pie, a paradox that made the mayor's old truck sound like a symphony of misplaced pride. A lone cicada sang a monotone solo, reminding everyone that even insects audition for the role of background music. Just as the last echo of the marching band died, Mr. Hensley, the eccentric clockmaker, set his grandfather's pocket watch on the town square's bench, allowing the seconds to slip like gossip through a cracked window. Children chased fireflies, their giggles bouncing off the brick walls like retro arcade beeps. The scent of hot tar from a nearby road repair seeped into the evening, a reminder that progress sometimes smells like a burnt popcorn kernel. A stray cat, fur speckled with dust, strutted past the mayor's polished shoes, pausing to stare as if demanding a mayoral endorsement. The community, in that brief pause, felt the absurd comfort of a world that still turned, however clumsily. Old Mrs. Delgado, who claims she once saw a UFO over the cornfield, leaned on her cane and whispered, "Even the stars need a coffee break," as she sipped her lukewarm tea from a chipped mug. The wind carried the faint jingle of a dropped bottle cap, turning it into a makeshift rhythm section for the night's quiet. A stray balloon, orange as a 90s sitcom couch, floated lazily over the town's gazebo, defying gravity like a rebellious teenager. The collective sigh that rose from the crowd was less a sigh of relief and more a shared exhale after a marathon of polite small talk. In that moment, the mundane stitched itself into a tapestry of tiny, absurd triumphs. When the last lantern dimmed, the streets fell into a soft hush, broken only by the occasional screech of a raccoon dragging a half-eaten cheeseburger across the curb. The townspeople filed back into their homes, shoulders slumped, yet somehow lighter, as if the day's quiet drama had been binge-watched in the background of their lives. The night air carried a hint of pine from the nearby forest, reminding everyone that even in a small town, the world outside still spins its own Netflix series. A lone owl hooted, sounding suspiciously like a vintage synthesizer, and the mayor chuckled, realizing the day's climax was a chorus of ordinary sounds. With a final glance at the moonlit sky, they all whispered, "Same time tomorrow," and the town settled into its beloved, uneventful rhythm. The rooster's crow was swallowed by a cotton-soft hush, and the town bell, normally the snarl of brass that rattles news into every cobblestone, lay mute as a dead battery. Elder Mara shuffled her weathered shawl, eyes narrowing like a cat eyeing a mouse, while young apprentice Tomas clutched his ink-soaked quill as if it were a flashlight. A thin plume of damp earth rose from the well, carrying the sour scent of yesterday's rain mixed with fresh bread that never got its morning fanfare. Villagers peered from shuttered windows, mouths forming silent oh-ohs, wondering if the bell had simply taken a coffee break. The air trembled with the absurdity of a town that woke up without its favorite alarm. One by one, the folk spilled into the square, their boots kicking up dust that glittered like powdered sugar under the pale sun. The baker, Mrs. Crumb, offered a waft of cinnamon rolls that swirled into the crowd, making stomachs grumble louder than any missing chime. Tomas tried to scribble a summons on the notice board, but his ink smeared like a toddler's masterpiece. Still, he managed to carve a crude gather. With a dagger-sharp stick, Elder Mara raised her hand, her voice cracking like an old vinyl record, and asked who had silenced the bell, sparking a chorus of nervous chuckles. A stray cat, unimpressed, sauntered past, its tail flicking the scent of wet alley gutters into the mix. Someone whispered that perhaps a mischievous sprite had stolen the clapper, like a teenager swiping the last slice of pizza at a school cafeteria. Tomas snorted, comparing the vanished toll to the plot twist in the latest streaming drama, where the hero's sidekick vanishes into thin air, except here. No dramatic music followed. The blacksmith Gunnar hammered his fist on his anvil, producing a clang that echoed like a misplaced car alarm, only to realize it was just his own impatience. A group of teenagers giggled, claiming the silence felt like a Netflix buffering moment. Everything paused, waiting for the next episode that never arrived. Elder Mara, unamused, warned that waiting for a glitch to fix itself could invite more than just gossip. It could summon the town's forgotten ghosts. Speculation swirled like the morning mist over Willowbrook's river, each theory as tangled as the cobwebs in the attic church. Some swore they heard a faint hum from the abandoned windmill, a low growl that could have been a distant tractor or a secretive dragon on a coffee break. Tomas, ever the chronicler, noted the smell of burnt toast lingering near the bell tower, a scent that hinted at an accidental fire, or perhaps a culinary experiment gone rogue. Elder Mara reminded everyone that silence, however comforting, can be a trap. The kind that makes mice squeak louder and gossip spread faster than a viral TikTok dance. The crowd leaned in, breath fogging in the chill, as they prepared to hunt the invisible hand that had snatched their morning ritual. With the bells still mute, the day stretched before them like an unrolled parchment waiting for ink. Elder Mara declared that they'd write a new story today, one where whispers replace clangs and curiosity fuels the market stalls. Tomas, already scribbling furiously, vowed to capture every oddity, from the smell of wet horsehair to the taste of sunrise, on a tongue still numb from surprise. The villagers, half amused and half bewildered, dispersed to their trades, each step echoing a quiet defiance against the absent toll. And so Willowbrook marched into a day as quiet as a librarian's sneeze, ready to discover that sometimes the loudest news lives in the spaces between the missing bells. When the sun vaulted over the crooked bell tower, its golden teeth bit into the cobblestones, scattering dust like glittered confetti. A flock of rumors fluttered overhead, restless sparrows of gossip that pecked at every empty headline. The baker's oven sighed, spilling warm rye scent that mingled with the dry, unspoken tension hanging over the square. Children chased each other's shadows, oblivious to the hush that settled like a blanket over the town. Even the wind seemed to hold its breath, waiting for a story that never arrived. At the market, vendors lowered their voices to a murmur, as if fearing the very air might betray a secret. Mrs. Kettle, who normally hawked lemons with a laugh louder than a brass band, now whispered guesses about why the town's newsprint stayed blank, her eyebrows doing a frantic tango. The clink of copper pans grew sparse, replaced by the rustle of hand-to-hand speculation that smelled faintly of stale cheese and fresh panic. A stray dog nosed the discarded flyers, found nothing but the scent of disappointment somewhere between the stalls. A lanky teenager muttered, "I guess the world's finally running on silence mode, like my dad's old VCR." Tomas, the town clerk with ink-stained fingers, slipped a leather-bound ledger onto the cracked wooden bench and began to tally each hushed conjecture. He scribbled possible alien abduction in looping script, then crossed it out with a flourish, replacing it with Mayer's secret tea stash. The quill scratched like a restless mouse, filling pages with a catalog of what-ifs that smelled of old parchment and nervous sweat. He paused, glanced at the crowd, and chuckled. If only the headlines were as dramatic as my grandmother's gossip about the church choir's karaoke night. A stray sunbeam caught the ledger's gold edge, turning it into a tiny, ironic beacon of recorded nothingness. As the midday heat pressed down, the weight of missing information grew heavier than the town's notorious cheese wheel that rolled into the square each Thursday. Faces tightened, shoulders hunched, and a collective sigh rose like a low-key choir performing an unrehearsed dirge. The clock tower's hands moved in slow motion, each tick echoing like a drumbeat of anticipation that no one dared to break. Somewhere a goat bleated, its bray sounding oddly like a news ticker malfunction, while Mrs. Kettle muttered, "Even the goats want a scoop." The silence, once a fleeting lullaby, now stretched into a stubbornly stubborn silence that felt like standing in a bathtub full of cold soup. By the time the sun reached its zenith, the town's chatter resembled a sitcom freeze frame. Characters frozen in mid-sentence, the audience waiting for a laugh track that never came. Tomas closed his ledger with a decisive thump, the sound echoing like a gavel in a courtroom of rumors. He lifted his head, grinned, and declared, "Well, folks, we've just invented the world's first silent headline. Might as well call it Breaking Nothing." A chuckle rippled through the stalls, the tension loosening like a rubber band snapped by an over-eager dog. As the day wore on, the townspeople learned to fill the void with their own stories, proving that even without news, life could still be broadcast in the most delightfully absurd ways. The sun beat down on Maple Hollow like a giant kitchen timer ticking toward noon's last gasp. Sweat pooled in the backs of the townsfolk as they abandoned their usual haunts, newsstand, gossip circle, and the ever-buzzing town radio for something cooler, something older. Rumor had it that the old well behind the churchyard still kept its secrets sealed beneath a lid of moss and rust. Mara, who could sniff a stale croissant from 3 blocks away, led the reluctant procession, her sandals slapping against cracked stone as if marching to a silent drum. Even the cicadas seemed to sigh in relief, their chirps turning into a lazy hum that matched the town's sudden pause. The well gaped like a yawning mouth, its stone walls slick with the scent of earth, dampness, and the faint perfume of long-forgotten goat milk. Inside, rows of ancient tablets leaned against each other, their surfaces etched with characters that looked like a medieval version of Comic Sans. A moth fluttered past, scattering dust that glittered like tiny gold coins in the shafts of light that fought their way down the shaft. Tomas, whose eyebrows could rival the height of a cathedral spire, brushed away the grime, exposing carvings that told of harvests, raids, and the occasional love affair between a blacksmith and a baker's daughter. The air was thick with the taste of rust, and the faint, sour whiff of something that had been sealed for centuries. Maybe a dead rat, maybe history itself. As the duo shuffled deeper, their boots kicked up a chorus of clanks and squeaks, echoing off the stone like a bad karaoke night in a cathedral. Suddenly, a faint click rang out, and a section of the wall shivered, revealing a narrow compartment hidden behind a stone lion's paw. Mara peered inside, her eyes widening like a gamer spotting a secret level, while Tomas steadied his breath, his heart drumming a rhythm that could outpace any marching band. The compartment cradled a single parchment, its edges browned and curled as if it had survived a desert trek across the Sahara, and then settled into a cozy attic. Even the well's stale breath seemed to pause, listening for the story that the parchment was about to whisper. The parchment unfurled with a sigh, revealing a cryptic line written in ink that glowed faintly, as if someone had mixed moonlight with midnight coffee. It read, "When the sun's shadow lies flat, the town shall hold its breath, the news shall rest, lest the world hear the echo of its own silence." Mara chuckled, noting the irony that the town's biggest gossip machine, its news, had been voluntarily knocked out. Like a sitcom that suddenly goes on hiatus without warning. Tomas, half serious, half Marvel fan, mused that perhaps they discovered the town's version of the snap from Thanos, except instead of wiping half the population, it paused every headline. The cryptic note hinted at an intentional pause, a deliberate lull in the chatter, as if the ancestors had set a timer for the town's collective breath. Word spread faster than a cat video on the internet, and the townsfolk gathered around the well, listening to the echo of that silent command. The afternoon air turned from oppressive heat to a strange, cool reverence, as if the town had collectively stepped into a living museum exhibit titled Quiet Hours. Children perched on stone steps, their laughter muffled, while elders swayed, recalling stories that smelled of tobacco and pine, now tinged with the fresh scent of curiosity. In that moment, Maple Hollow felt like a character in an ancient epic, its heartbeat syncing with the well's slow drip, each drop a punctuation mark in the town's paused news cycle. And so, the afternoon echoes lived on, a reminder that sometimes the loudest announcements are the ones you never hear, especially when a well decides to be the town's new gossip columnist. The sun bled orange across the thatched roofs of Hollowford as the town's crier unrolled the day's parchment, its ink still glistening like fresh coffee. The scroll hissed a warning. A storm would roll in, fierce enough to swallow the bell's voice whole if the metal heart were left unattended. A low murmur spread through the crowd, half dread, half disbelief, as the wind began to sniff the cobblestones with a salty promise. Old Marta, perched on her porch, sniffed the scent of wet hay, and muttered that even the clouds sounded like they were auditioning for a heavy metal band. With twilight draping like a velvet curtain, the villagers felt the first tremor of a night that might end in deafening silence. The thought of the bell going mute made more people nervous than the prospect of a tax collector on a Monday. Jasper, The blacksmith joked that a silent bell would be the village's version of a Wi-Fi outage, unacceptable and oddly terrifying. Children clutched their wooden toys, ears straining for the faintest toll, while the scent of burnt toast drifted from the bakery, reminding everyone that life still smelled like dough. Marta's cat, Sir Whiskers, leapt onto the bell rope, his tail flicking like a metronome, as if to mock the looming quiet. The fear of silence, a phantom louder than any gale, forced the townsfolk to swallow their pride and pull together like a mismatched choir. Ropes were ripped from the forge, their fibers thick as a knight's beard, and the men and women scrambled into the square, boots squelching in the soon-to-mud. They tethered the massive bronze bell to a sturdy oak, hammering metal brackets with the urgency of gamers chasing a final boss timer. Sweat mingled with the earthy smell of rain-soaked dirt, and a stray goat bleated a mournful solo that sounded suspiciously like a broken karaoke track. Even the mayor, usually as stiff as a board, slipped on a puddle and slipped a joke about slipping into silence that made everyone snort despite the looming thunder. The frantic choreography of pulling, tying, and praying turned the square into a chaotic, yet oddly rhythmic, dance of survival. The storm burst onto the scene with a bass drum crack that rattled the windows and made the church's stained glass shiver like a nervous teenager. Rain hammered the roofs, and wind howled, trying to drown the bell. But the metal beast roared back, its tone cutting through the chaos like a superhero theme song. Villagers huddled beneath the oak, their faces lit by lightning, each flash revealing a tableau of drenched hair, smeared mud, and triumphant grins. When the first toll finally rang, it sang a guttural V8 growl that echoed over the flood, sending a shiver of pride up even the most stoic farmer's spine. The storm, defeated by a community's clamor, retreated as if embarrassed, leaving behind a chorus of wheezing whistles and relieved sighs. As the clouds peeled away, a salty breeze carried the aftertaste of ozone and the faint aroma of wet pine, a reminder that the night had survived the test. The bell, now swaying gently, seemed to hum a lullaby that whispered, "We survived, we sang, we will not be silenced." Marta poured herself a mug of nightcap tea, inhaling the warm steam, and chuckling that the only thing louder than the storm had been the collective heartbeats of the town. Children rolled in the puddles, their splashes creating a percussion section that rivaled the bell's own echo, proving that even silence can be broken into music. Thus, the evening crescendo faded into a quiet that was anything but mute, a reminder that when a village finds its voice, even the heavens have to listen. When the final thundercloud rolled off the ridge like a tired cat, the town exhaled a collective sigh that smelled of pine sap and burnt oatmeal. The great brass bell, which had been poised to clang, now lay swaddled in a sack of straw, its clang muted to a whisper of moth wings. Candles flickered in windows, casting amber halos that danced on cobblestones slick with rain. Children, still damp from the storm, squatted on stoops, listening for the drip-drip of leaky roofs rather than the usual clamor of tavern shouts. Even the wind seemed to lean in, curious about the quiet that had finally settled over the night. Tomas, the town scribe with a beard as tangled as old rope, slid his quill across the final line of the ledger, sealing the day's quiet observations with a flourish of ink. He recorded the way the church organ hummed low, like a cat purring under a blanket of dust, and noted the faint perfume of wet hay that lingered in the market square. The pages now held a chorus of absent sounds: the missing rooster's crow, the silenced gossip at the inn, the unspoken sigh of Mrs. Dalloway's stew cooling on the fire. He smiled, because in a world that glorified noise, he had captured the very thing people rarely write about: stillness. With a satisfied sigh, he shut the heavy oak lid, its thud echoing like a distant drumbeat in the hush. Elder Mara, whose eyes glittered like amber in the lamplight, rose from her rickety stool and raised her gnarled hand, the scar on her knuckle catching the candle's glow. She announced, with the gravitas of a town crier and the wit of a late-night talk show host, that this recorded silence would become a yearly rite, a nightfall record to honor the unheard. We'll meet each autumn, just as the leaves turn the color of old money, and we'll listen to the spaces between our words, she declared, her voice rippling through the rafters. The council murmured in agreement, their nods as steady as the slow tick of the town's ancient clock tower. The promise hung in the air, sweet as fresh baked rye bread, waiting to be tasted. The townsfolk erupted into chuckles, some comparing the new tradition to a silent mode update on their favorite gizmos, while old Jeb muttered that he'd finally have an excuse to avoid his mother-in-law's banjo practice. A teenage lad whispered that this could be the perfect backdrop for his secret rap battle, because nothing beats a quiet crowd when you drop a rhyme. Even the stray dog, a mangy mutt named Scruff, seemed to perk up, his ears twitching at the novelty of a night without the usual clatter of plates. Mothers tucked their children into beds, telling them that the silence was a lullaby composed by the town itself, richer than any lullaby Spotify could stream. In the midst of irony, the community felt a warm glow, as if they'd just discovered a hidden Easter egg in the game of life. As the moon climbed higher, its silver light spilled onto the cobblestones, turning puddles into mirrors that reflected the town's humbled faces. The scent of night jasmine drifted from the garden walls, mingling with the lingering aroma of tea left cooling on wooden tables. Tomas lingered by the doorway, feeling the pulse of the quiet like a slow beating heart, grateful that his ledger now sang a song of stillness. Elder Mara's words lingered, a promise that each year the town would press pause on their bustling saga, to listen to the whispers that usually slip through the cracks. And so, beneath the sighing oaks, the Nightfall record began its first chapter, a testament that sometimes the most powerful stories are told without saying a single word. At the first blush of sunrise, Willowbrook's thatched roofs catch a pink glow that makes the village look like a cake frosting. Farmer Tomas rolls out of his straw-filled mattress, splashes cold water on his face, and curses the rooster for being louder than a brass band. He laces his boots, the leather creaking like an old hinge, and drags the battered cart loaded with fleecy wool that smells of meadow and musk. The air is crisp, carrying the faint perfume of damp earth and distant pine, while his dog, Scruff, snorts and nudges a carrot as if to say, "Don't forget breakfast." Just beyond the crossroads, Elsie, the baker, opens her shop with a grin as warm as her ovens. She slides the heavy stone door aside, releasing a wave of yeasty heat that rolls through the street like a comforting blanket. The dough rises in its tubs, puffing up like a lazy dragon, while the scent of fresh rye and butter battles the morning chill. She kneads with elbows that have seen more flour than a snowstorm, humming a tune that would make a modern pop star blush. When the first loaves pop out of the oven, they crackle like applause, promising a crunchy bite for any market day haggler. Mara, the itinerant merchant, rolls into Willowbrook on a squeaky wooden wagon, its wheels whining like an out-of-tune violin. She unloads bundles of copper tools that glint in the sunrise, each hammer and tongs polished to a shine that could rival a superhero's armor. Her satchel bursts with colorful bolts of cloth, cheese wheels that emit a tangy scent strong enough to make a dairy cow weep, and a dozen half-eaten apples that look like they survived a pirate raid. She greets the villagers with a wink and a joke about the stock market, the only market where the only crash involves a broken cartwheel. Despite the mud splattering her boots, Mara's laughter rings out, echoing across the lanes like an old radio jingle, and she promises a bargain that would make a modern influencer swoon. As the sun climbs higher, the village square transforms into a chaotic chorus of shouts, clinks, and the occasional goat bleat. The market stalls line the cobblestones, each draped in faded canvas that flutters like a pirate's flag in a gentle breeze. Villagers barter wool for cheese, copper tools for fresh loaves, and swap gossip as readily as they swap copper pennies that feel heavy in their palm. The air becomes a stew of sour milk, smoked meat, and the metallic tang of newly forged nails, while a stray dog rolls in a puddle of muddy water, sending a splash of earth-scented slime onto a nearby customer's boots. Even the mayor, perched on a wooden crate, watches the dance of commerce with a grin, muttering that this lively chaos is more reliable than any railway schedule. When the last transaction is sealed and the sun begins its lazy descent, the stalls fold away like tired actors taking a final bow. The villagers drift back to their cottages, the echo of barter still humming in their ears like a catchy jingle from a late-night TV ad. Tomas carries his empty cart home, feeling the weight of his day's earnings as light as a feather, while Elsie's flower-kissed hands tremble with the promise of tomorrow's loaves. Mara straps her wagon, humming a tune that sounds suspiciously like a modern pop chorus, and promises to return next week with even shinier gadgets. In Willowbrook, the rhythm of market day beats like a heart, reminding everyone that even in the 19th century, life was a mix of hard work, humor, and the occasional surprise plot twist worthy of a Netflix binge. The market square buzzed like a beehive on a summer day, stalls draped in half-torn canvas, the scent of fresh herbs fighting the sour whiff of horse manure. A ragged flyer fluttered from the magistrate's postern, whispering of a new tax that would gnaw at every stallholder's bottom line. Vendors clutched their ledgers tighter than a toddler clutching a candy bar, eyes darting to the town crier, who seemed to have swallowed a megaphone. Children darted between crates, knocking over a barrel of sour cherries that splashed like a medieval slapstick. Even the town's lone troubadour paused his lute, as if the impending levy could mute his strings forever. Tomas, whose shaggy flock of merino sheep grazed on the outskirts, felt his heart thump like a drum in a war march. He imagined the magistrate's tax collector poking his fingers into the wool, counting each strand as if it were gold coins from a pirate's chest. The thought of his herd's soft treasure being taxed made his stomach churn with the same intensity as a kettle of sour broth left too long on the fire. He paced the muddy lane, muttering curses that would make a sailor blush, and tried to bargain with the ghost of his grandfather's stubbornness. By sunset, his hands were stained with mud and wool, but his resolve was as prickly as a cactus in a desert of doubts. Across the cobblestones, Elsie stood before her flour sacks, which smelled of dust and hope, and felt the weight of looming prices like a sack of lead. She imagined the magistrate's ledger demanding a slice of her family's daily bread, turning her humble loaves into luxury items fit for a king's banquet. The market's chatter turned into a chorus of sighs, each cough punctuated by the clatter of copper coins hitting stone. She pictured the village children gnawing on stale biscuits, their faces a mix of innocence and the bitter taste of famine. With a wry grin, she muttered, "If only I could sell my flour on the black market like a medieval Netflix streaming service. We'd all be binge-watching abundance." Mara, who ran the shadowy corner stall dealing in contraband herbs and whispered rumors, weighed her options like a chess player. With a queen that could flip the board, she knew the tax could choke the market's lifeblood, turning lively barter into a silent graveyard of empty stalls. The idea of a clandestine trade, selling goods under the table, hidden like a wizard's wand, sparkled in her mind. Though it smelled of sweat, spilled ale, and the faint whiff of danger, she imagined slipping a sack of wool under a hay bale, delivering flour in a secret compartment of a cart, all while humming a tune reminiscent of a rebellious pirate anthem. Yet the irony was thick. The very law meant to fill the magistrate's coffers could be the very thing that fed a secret economy, turning the village into a covert Gotham of commerce. As dusk painted the sky in bruised purples, the villagers gathered around the old oak, the air thick with anticipation and the sour tang of fear. The magistrate arrived on a horse that squeaked like a rusty hinge, his robes flapping like a moth's wings caught in a gust. He declared the tax with the gravitas of a Netflix trailer narrator, promising riches for the crown and sacrifice for the people. Tomas tightened his grip on his wool. Elsie's eyes narrowed on her flour, and Mara slipped a wink to a fellow trader, the silent promise of rebellion humming in the night. The market survived that day, not because the levy was lifted, but because the villagers, armed with humor, iron will, and a dash of outlaw spirit, turned the looming tax into a story they'd tell for generations. The sky over Willowbrook darkened like a bruised plum, and a summer storm rolled in faster than a runaway horse at a county fair. The river that bisected the market swelled, turning its gentle murmur into a deafening roar that rattled the wooden walkways. Traders, slick with sweat and woolen coats, stared up as rain hammered the canvas awnings, turning them into soggy shields. Children squealed, ducking under stalls, while the old bell ringer's rope snapped under the gale, sending a clang that sounded like a misplaced cymbal in a marching band. It was a scene that would have made even Shakespeare whisper, "What's in a storm?" Except the answer was a mess of mud and mayhem. The river burst its banks, sweeping away crates of smoked ham, barrels of honey, and a precarious tower of jam jars that clinked like glassy marbles. Fresh water surged, sloshing through the cobblestones, leaving behind a stench of mud, fish, and the sweet rot of overturned fruit. Merchants lunged, their boots sucking up sludge as they tried to grab floating goods, only to be splashed by the river's cold, cheeky slap. One enterprising baker, seeing his dough rise in the flood, shouted, "Free bread! Free bread!" while a stray cow floated past, mooing like a confused submarine. The market's rhythm turned chaotic, each splash a percussion beat in a wet, awful symphony that would make even the most stoic of town elders wet their britches. Just as the water calmed, a plume of black smoke curled up from the east side, where the neighboring village of Brackenford had set fire to the prized spice stall. The flames licked the air with a crackling hiss, releasing a hot perfume of cumin, pepper, and burnt canvas that made the onlookers cough and swear in equal measure. "You sneaky foxes," barked old Martha, the spice queen, shaking her fists while the fire danced like a jealous cat on a keyboard. Think of those YouTube videos. The fire's orange glare painted the faces of the traders in a grotesque sunset, turning the market into a stage for a drama that felt part tragedy, part farce. The jealous Brackenford folk had hoped to cripple Willowbrook's commerce, not realizing they'd just ignited a rivalry hotter than a dragon's breath in a medieval costume party. The Willowbrook crew sprang into action, grabbing wet blankets, buckets, and a half-broken wagon to douse the blaze while still rescuing soggy wares from the river's grip. Their shouts echoed through the market, a mix of pass the water and don't let the jam slip, creating a chorus that sounded oddly like a marching squad in a Lord of the Rings battle scene. Amidst the chaos, a lanky tinsmith slipped on a banana peel left by the flooding, landing with a splash that sent a cloud of metal shavings into the air like glitter at a pop concert. Yet the traders' determination was ironclad. They formed a human chain, passing drenched sacks hand to hand, their faces smeared with mud and soot, but eyes bright with defiant grit. By the time the last ember died, the market looked like a battlefield after a paintball match, splattered, smelly, and strangely victorious. With the river receded and the flames snuffed out, Willowbrook's merchants gathered beneath the repaired awnings, laughing at their own soggy shoes and singed sleeves. They toasted with mugs of bitter ale, calling the day the ultimate test of willpower and waterproof tarps, a phrase that would soon become tavern folklore. The jealous Brackenford folks slunk away, their plan foiled, but not before a mischievous child from Willowbrook tossed a caramel sticky note across the border that read, "Nice try, but we've got more grit than your Instagram filters." As twilight settled, fireflies flickered above the market, casting a gentle glow over the reclaimed stalls, reminding everyone that even after disaster, life smells of roasted meat and fresh hay. And so the day closed with a chorus of grateful sighs, a few stray chickens clucking like they just survived a horror movie, and traders promising to keep the river crossing dry, at least until the next sitcom episode of Village Life. The sky wept a relentless drizzle as the bell of the old stone church tolled 12 times, announcing market day in the mud-slick village of Brackenford. Half-drunk farmers lugged their baskets of potatoes, squinting through the veil of rain like paparazzi at a royal wedding. Women in threadbare shawls huddled under tarpaulins, their voices a chorus of clucks and curses that blended with the scent of wet hay and goat cheese. Even the stray dog, whose fur smelled like a cellar, wagged its tail, as if it too had a ticket to the show. At the far end of the cobbled square, the tax collector swaggered in, his polished boots squeaking on the puddles like a villain in a silent film. He unfurled a crinkly ledger, the ink as black as the night before the harvest, and declared the usual levy with a grin that could curdle cream. The villagers stared, their eyes narrowing like a group of gamers spotting a glitch in the system. A murmuring chorus rose, half whisper, half roar, as old Marta lifted her basket and shouted, "We'll give you the crops, not the coin." The collector's mustache twitched, unsure whether to laugh or call for reinforcements. Without missing a beat, the farmers piled sacks of golden wheat, the smell of fresh grain rising like a promise of summer. Weaver Elsie spread out a rainbow of hand-woven scarves, their wool still warm from the loom, while the blacksmith hammered out tiny iron charms that clanged like tiny bells. Children traded sticky apple cores for cracked pottery, the tang of cider mingling with the earthy perfume of damp soil. The crowd formed a living market wall, each stall a piece of a jigsaw puzzle that refused to be broken by a single tax note. Even the rain seemed to applaud, pattering on tin roofs in a rhythm that matched their defiant heartbeats. The tax collector's quill hovered uselessly above his parchment, as helpless as a cat in a bath. He tried to shout orders, but his voice was swallowed by the chorus of clattering barter and the occasional snort of a farmer who'd had enough of authority. The market square froze in a tableau of solidarity, the only motion coming from the steam rising off steaming turnips and the occasional sputter of a squeaky cartwheel. Ironically, the only tax he collected that day was a heavy dose of embarrassment, served up on a platter of mud-splattered boots. With a sigh that sounded like a deflated balloon, he slunk back toward the manor, his escort muttering something about, "Next time we bring the cavalry." By nightfall, the rain stopped, leaving the cobbles glistening like a polished arcade floor, and the villagers toasted their victory with mugs of fermented beet juice that smelled like sweet rot. They sang a bawdy ballad about the great market day revolt, a tune that would later echo in taverns, from here to the far-flung city of London, where even the Queen's guards might have tapped their boots in secret. The tax collector's report arrived weeks later, listing zero revenue and a footnote. The peasants have discovered barter, recommend adding comic relief to the next decree. In the end, the market stood not as a place of commerce alone, but as a stage where ordinary folk could script their own epic, complete with rain, mud, and a dash of cheeky rebellion. And so, whenever a drizzle threatens a market day, the villagers grin and remember that sometimes the best payment is a collective "no thanks," shouted louder than any coin could clink. In the weeks that followed the daring market showdown, the tale of the defiant stalls slipped from hearth to tavern like a hot slice of rye bread. Children whispered it aloud while chasing chickens, and old men swore they could still hear the clatter of overturned ledgers echoing in the wind. The story sprouted gossip buds in every corner of the village, from the cobbler's damp cellar to the wind-blown fields where wheat stalks swayed like impatient audience members. Even the church bell, usually solemn, seemed to ring a little offbeat, as if laughing at the audacity of the peasants who turned a tax day into a carnival of rebellion. When the market finally reopened, it did so with a vigor that could knock a horse off its saddle. Stalls burst into color, vivid reds of beetroot, the glossy sheen of fresh caught trout, the earthy perfume of mushrooms that smelled like rain on a cellar floor. Merchants shouted prices louder than a town crier on a caffeine high, while the scent of roasting pork mingled with the sharp tang of soot from the nearby forge. The crowd moved like a river of wool coats and mud-splattered boots, each step stirring up the sweet, yeasty aroma of spilled ale that begged for another round. The magistrate, upon seeing the market humming like a well-tuned fiddle, finally lifted the outrageous tax, muttering something about too much fuss for a few pennies. Villagers cheered so loudly that the mayor's hat flew off his head and landed in Mrs. Green's laundry basket, much to her delight and the mayor's embarrassment. They celebrated by tossing the old tax receipts into the river, watching them whirl like confetti at a birthday party for a newborn calf. The irony was as thick as the barn's hay. Those who tried to choke commerce ended up feeding it, and the whole village had a good laugh at the irony of a tax holiday that felt more like a sitcom episode than a legal decree. Decades turned to centuries, and the once forgotten market day settled into the fabric of village lore like a patchwork quilt stitched with stories of stubbornness and sweet-smelling success. Grandchildren learned the tale from their grandparents, who would pause mid-story to point at the ancient oak where the original protest had taken root. Now home to squirrels that chatter like gossiping gossip mongers. The day became a quiet rite of passage, a reminder that cooperation can outwit even the most rigid authority. Think of it as the 19th century equivalent of a superhero team-up, only with more potatoes and fewer capes. Folks still whisper about the forgotten day, when the church bells chime a little softer, as if paying respect to the stubborn spirit that still lingers in the market's cobblestones. And so, the echoes of that defiant market reverberate through the ages, a testament to the gritty, greasy, glorious heart of 19th century village commerce. The scent of fresh bread and iron still drifts on the breezes, mingling with the faint, lingering chuckle of a tax collector who finally learned to smile. Each new generation steps onto the same square, feeling the pulse of past traders beneath their boots, and realizes that resilience isn't just a word, it's the smell of sweat, the taste of stubbornness, and the sound of a community that refuses to be silenced. In the end, the forgotten market day isn't forgotten at all. It's the secret handshake of every villager who ever bartered, bargained, or simply enjoyed a good laugh over a barrel of cider. In the cradle of rolling green hills, Brindleford perched like a rust-caked tin soldier, its thatched roofs puffing smoke like lazy dragons. The stone church, older than any living soul in town, stood watch, its bell a bronze throat that belted the sunrise, the market rush, and even the mournful sighs of widows. When the first rooster crowed, the bell answered with a clang that rattled the cobbles and sent crumbs scattering from Elise's bakery windows. Shepherd Tomas, who counted his flock by the echo of that toll, swore the bell could hear his prayers as clearly as a goat hears a lullaby. The whole village moved to that metallic metronome, as if the very soil kept time with each resonant ring. One bleary morning, the bell yawned and fell mute, leaving the air as empty as a tavern after a keg spill contest. Tomas trudged out with his staff, ears straining, only to hear the wind licking the church's stone walls like a cat licking a forgotten milk saucer. Elise, wiping flour from her forearms, looked up from a tray of steaming scones and wondered if the oven had finally learned to sing. The silence sat heavy, a thick fog of unasked questions that smelled faintly of damp wool and stale rye. Even the village dog, a scrappy mutt named Sir Barks-a-Lot, halted his endless tail wagging, as if waiting for a cue he'd never been given. Well, Tomas muttered, maybe the bell finally got a subscription to Netflix and is binge watching the silence. He tried clapping his hands, hoping the echo would coax the bronze beast back, but only his own palms answered with a thin slap that sounded like a broken record. Elise, ever the pragmatist, tossed a fresh bun onto the cold stone. The dough hitting the floor with a squelch that reminded her of mud-covered boots after a rainstorm. The townsfolk gathered, whispering jokes about a cursed monk who'd taken a vow of no ding. Their laughter cracked the stillness like a cracked pot, spilling warm, buttery humor over the grim scene. Meanwhile, the mayor, an older man who wore a hat as tall as a medieval tower, declared an emergency council where the agenda was simply find the bell or invent a Spotify playlist for sunrise. Children dragged a rusty bucket, hoping the sound would splash back, while the innkeeper offered free ale as a bribe to any spirit daring enough to ring again. The church's cracked windows rattled with the wind, letting in the scent of damp earth and the distant whiff of goat cheese, a reminder that life, gross, pungent, and delicious, kept on regardless. Ironically, the silence made the village hear itself, each heartbeat louder than any bronze clang could ever be. As dusk painted the sky in bruised purple, Tomas stood by the bell's still mouth and whispered, "If you're listening, give us a sign, something less dramatic than a dragon breathing fire. Please." Elise, kneading dough in the dim light, felt the rhythm of her fingertips match the invisible pulse of the village, a tempo that no metal could dictate. The night air smelled of smoky peat and the sweet aftertaste of yesterday's pies, a comforting reminder that traditions survive in the marrow of people, not just in ringing metal. In the end, Brindleford learned that a quiet bell could be a louder teacher, teaching patience, humor, and the stubborn resilience of a hamlet that refused to miss a beat. And somewhere, perhaps in a dusty attic, the bell simply waited for a proper Spotify playlist to finally get its groove on. Morning light draped the thatched roofs like a cheap velvet curtain, but the usual clang of the church bell was missing, leaving the air oddly still. Cows lowed in the fields, their mooing echoing a lonely hymn against the backdrop of a sky that smelled of fresh-cut hay and the faint sting of burnt soot from the last night's fire. Old Mateo, the sexton, shuffled to the tower with a candle that sputtered like a nervous teenager's first text, his steps reverberating on the wooden stairs. He peered into the empty void where the bronze mouth should have boomed, and the only sound was his own heartbeat thudding like a drum solo in a silent stadium. The whole village seemed to hold its breath, waiting for the bell that never came, as if the world had hit pause on a vintage sitcom. Farmer Tomas stood at the edge of his furrowed field, hands slick with yesterday's rain, and stared at the stubborn soil as if it might answer his prayers. Without the bell's cue, the rhythm of sowing turned into a nervous jitter, each seed feeling like a tiny gamble in a game of chance he never signed up for. He muttered to his old mule, "We'll have to improvise. Buddy, maybe the clouds can give us a marching band." The scent of damp earth rose, mingling with the pungent tang of pig manure, a reminder that life kept turning despite the missing soundtrack. He cracked a grin, recalling a joke about how even a Wi-Fi outage can't stop a rooster from crowing. Yet here the rooster seemed as shy as a teenager at a crush convention. Children gathered at the schoolyard, expecting the school bell's tinny chirp to signal the start of lessons. But only the wind answered, whistling through the cracked fence like a gossiping ant. Their footsteps slowed, and whispers spread faster than a meme about a cat playing the piano. Rumors that the silent bell was a bad omen of famine, of empty cupboards and hungry bellies. Little Elise clutched a loaf of sourdough that smelled like fermented regret. Its crust hardened like an old wizard's beard. The scent of chalk dust mingled with the sweet, musty aroma of dried beans simmering in the communal oven, a fragrant reminder that the village still fed itself despite the dread. One boy joked that maybe the bell got a day off to binge watch Game of Thrones, only to be shushed by his mother's sharp stare. Tomas and Elise, each tethered to their daily chores like horses to a plow, met at the base of the bell tower, their faces etched with worry and a dash of stubborn humor. They lifted the heavy oak lid, and a cloud of dust rose, smelling of old leather boots and the faint perfume of lavender, sachets that the priest once used to mask incense burns. Inside, a frayed rope dangled like a tired cat's tail, its fibers split open, whispering I quit with every creak of the wooden beam. Tomas pulled at the rope, his fingers raw and gritty, while Elise sniffed the stale air, noting that the silence felt as oppressive as a summer heat wave in a laundry room. Their laughter cracked the tension as they imagined the rope auditioning for a role in The Fast and the Furious, medieval edition, with a makeshift knot and a prayer louder than a town crier's megaphone. They hoisted the cracked rope back into place, hearing a faint metallic sigh that felt like a belated applause after a long, silent act. The bell, though weary, gave a shallow clang that resonated through the cobblestones, shaking loose a swarm of dust mites who scattered like startled fans after a surprise cameo. The villagers erupted in cheers, some clapping with hands as rough as sandpaper, others dancing a jittery jig that reminded Tomas of a tick-tock challenge gone rogue. The scent of fresh rain mingled with the lingering aroma of the bell's oil, a greasy perfume that tasted of triumph and burnt toast. And as the sun dipped, casting amber shadows, the bell's echo lingered, reminding everyone that even a silent day can end with a bang, provided someone dares to pull the right rope. When the great brass bell fell mute, Tomas strapped his trusty goat skin rope to his waist and scrambled up the creaky wooden tower, the wind howling like a discontented banshee. The stairs smelled of mildewed hay and old sweat, each step groaning under his weight, as if the building itself were humming a low, disappointed tune. He brushed a cobweb off his cheek, wondering if the silence was a curse or just the village's version of a Wi-Fi outage. Below, the fields stretched golden, trembling with a harvest that seemed as nervous as a cat in a room full of rocking chairs. Meanwhile, Elise rallied the village elders, her voice cutting through the murmurs of gossip like a butter knife through stale cheese. She gathered them under the cracked oak that doubled as a meeting hall, its bark riddled with lichens that smelled faintly of sour milk. The elders shuffled in, clutching pipe smoked wisdom and a few too many jars of homemade jam, their eyes darting between the looming tower and the empty bell's throat. Elise's hands trembled as she unfurled an ancient ledger. Its pages yellowed like old parchment scrolls from a pirate's treasure chest. The ledger, penned in a script that looked like a drunk monk's doodles, revealed a forgotten covenant. The bell would only toll when the community acted as one, not when a single rope was mended. It spoke of rites where villagers sang together at sunrise, shared the last slice of bread, and even washed the mayor's feet after a rainstorm. Odd, yes, but oddly heartfelt. The revelation hit them harder than a sack of potatoes, the kind of slap that makes you spill your ale and reconsider your life choices. Laughter erupted, half in disbelief, half in the bitter taste of irony. Who thought their silence was a reminder to finally clean up their collective mess. As the harvest moon rose, ripening wheat swayed like a nervous audience waiting for the show's cue, and the air grew thick with the scent of damp earth and impending panic. Without the bell's call, the threshers hesitated, their scythes poised mid-air, as if waiting for a signal that never came. Tension crackled louder than a barn full of fireflies, and Tomas felt his heart thumping like a drum in a marching band. Only the band forgot its sheet music. The elders, now united by the ledger's truth, began chanting an old folk song, their voices trembling but growing louder, hoping to coax the silent metal into compliance. At the climax, the chorus rose. The wind caught the bell's rusted clapper, and with a reluctant sigh, the bronze finally gave a mournful, resonant boom that seemed to shake the very roots of the village. The sound rolled over the fields, startling crows into a chaotic ballet, and making the wheat tremble in applause. Tomas slid down the tower, landing in a heap of straw, while Elise wiped tears, part triumph, part relief, off her cheek, joking that the bell had finally gotten its Netflix subscription. The community, now truly united, laughed, sang, and promised never again to ignore the simple truth. Sometimes a voice needs not just a rope, but the willingness to speak together. The sun sank like a tired horse behind the low thatched roofs, spilling amber across the cobblestones that had heard more gossip than a royal court. At the heart of the village, the ancient stone bell tower stood mute, its bronze belly empty of the clang that once summoned harvest and hallowed prayer. Villagers, farmhands with mud-caked boots, the baker wielding a flour-dusted apron, and old Marta with a cane as gnarled as the oak, converged beneath its shadow like a troupe of reluctant actors awaiting a cue. The air smelled of damp earth, wilted nettles, and the lingering bite of yesterday's stew. They gathered not for a sermon, but for a kind of communal therapy, the kind you'd find on a reality TV show if the producers cared about wheat instead of drama. Someone hoisted a battered wooden table and spread a ragged spread of crusty rye, pungent cheese that threatened to melt into the elbows of anyone too eager, and a barrel of cider that fizzed like a mischievous sprite. Laughter burst out as Farmer Jeb recounted how the bell once rang at the exact moment his cow staged a rebellion, mooing louder than any church organ, an anecdote that earned him a playful shove and a chorus of snorts. Children chased each other around the base of the tower, their feet kicking up clouds of dust that glittered with the sparkle of beetle shells, while the elders swapped tales of wars and witches with the same relish they reserved for their Sunday roast. The clatter of wooden spoons against bowls provided a percussion section that could have fooled a medieval minstrel into thinking the bell was merely shy. Even the stray cat perched on the bell's brass crown, eyeing the feast like a paparazzo waiting for the next big headline. With bell ropes frayed like old love letters, the villagers set to work, hands slick with sweat and the occasional splatter of goat milk that dribbled from a clumsy lad's bucket. Marta, despite her cane, took charge, shouting directions that sounded like a general in a war movie. Only she commanded spades and twine instead of troops. The rope was pulled, unspooled, then reknit with fibers from the neighboring sheepherders' flocks, each strand humming faintly under the farmer's thumb, like a secret password to an ancient code. The smell of fresh-cut hay mingled with the sharp tang of pine sap, while the chorus of hooves and clanking tools created a rhythm that could rival any drum circle at a summer camp. As they lifted the heavy wooden beam to replace a cracked support, a stray gust of wind carried a whiff of burnt toast, proof that someone had finally remembered to light the hearth. The collective grunt and chuckle forged a resonance that seemed to vibrate through the very stones, as if the earth itself were humming a lullaby of solidarity. Jeb, wiping a smear of dirt from his cheek, remarked that the bell had been as silent as his teenage son during math class. Ironically, both now poised for a dramatic dramatic entrance, each tightened knot, each fresh shingle laid, added a beat to an invisible metronome, coaxing the dormant clapper from its slumber like a cat being lured by a laser pointer. The villagers felt the thrum in their chests, a low thrumming that reminded them of the first drumbeat of humanity, when men and women beat together to chase off wolves or celebrate a successful hunt. The iron bell, finally sensing the surge, gave a faint shiver, an almost imperceptible sigh that fluttered like a moth against a lantern. Then, with a sudden, jubilant crack, the clapper broke free, slamming against the bronze belly and unleashing a peal that ripped through the stillness like a firework on the 4th of July. The sound rolled over the fields, bouncing off rows of golden wheat, scattering crows into a panicked aerial ballet, and ricocheting off the cottage windows, making the elderly women gasp as if they'd heard a secret gossip. Children froze mid-run, eyes wide, while the bakers clutched their aprons, feeling the vibration through their flour-dusted sleeves, as if the bell had whispered, "I'm back, and I'm louder than your gossip." Laughter erupted, raw and unfiltered, mixing with tears that glistened like morning dew. The village felt reborn, its heartbeat now measured in ringing reverberations instead of silent anticipation. As the final echo faded, a lone sparrow perched atop the bell tower cocked its head and seemed to declare, "Well, that's one way to drop the beat." When the bell struck again, its bronze voice cracked the morning mist like an old vinyl scratching to life. The clang rolled over the low, thatched roofs, nudging the rooster into a grudging duet. Tomas swore he heard the bell chant a line from a rock ballad, but the village elders just called it a reminder to milk the cows. Children sprinted past the stone altar, their feet kicking up the sweet-smelling dew that clung to the rye. Even the stubborn goat, Gertie, gave a half-hearted bleat, as if she, too, were tapping her hooves to the rhythm. Elise, with flour dusting her apron like battlefield snow, turned the bell's echo into a marching order for the kitchen. She whisked butter into dough, while the sound bounced off the stone walls, a metronome for kneading elbows. Tomas, wielding his pitchfork like a conductor's baton, led the men to the fields, each step syncing with the lingering reverberation. The air tasted of fresh earth, rabbit burrows, and the faint tang of horse urine, rural perfume at its most authentic. A stray pig, mistaking the ringing for a call to the trough, trotted past, prompting a chorus of laughter that could rival any sitcom laugh track. When the sun climbed high, the wheat stood golden, swaying to the silent beat that the bell had left behind. Harvesters moved like a well-choreographed flash mob, their sickles flashing in the glare as though they were lightsabers in a low-budget Star Wars set. The scent of cut grain mingled with the earthy perfume of turned soil, a bouquet that made even the stoic priest sniff appreciatively. Tomas cracked a joke about the new season of The Walking Dead. Only the crops were the ones who rose from the dead, not the villagers. In the distance, the river gurgled a steady bass line, keeping time while the bell rested on its wooden stand, humbled but proud. Later, as twilight draped the hills in bruised purples, the bell fell silent, yet the village thrummed like a heart that refuses to stop. Children whispered that the bell had taken a coffee break, while the elders smiled, knowing that true rhythm lives in shared chores, not in clanging metal. The scent of smoked sausage drifted from the communal fire, mingling with the sharp tang of pine sap from the nearby woods. Tomas and Elise exchanged a glance, no words needed. Their shoulders bobbed in silent applause for the day's toil. Even the crickets, usually shy, sang louder, as if to fill the void left by the mute tower. When the feast finally erupted, tables groaned under baskets of ripe apples, jars of honey, and loaves thick enough to double as shields. Laughter ricocheted off the stone walls, louder than any bell, and a fiddler, cheeks flushed, played a tune that sounded suspiciously like the opening notes of a modern pop hit, just enough to make the older women grin. The community raised mugs of sour mulled cider, toasting the bell's return and the even richer harvest that proved routine is the secret spice of life. In that moment, the village realized that silence and sound are merely interchangeable verses in the same ballad, and as the night deepened, the bell, still quiet, seemed to grin from its perch, content that its true power now lived in the pulse of the people below. At the crack of dawn, the low hills of the Tigris floodplain glow like a smeared butter under the first light. Aram, a lanky teen with more freckles than confidence, shuffles out of his mud-caked hut, rubbing sleep from his eyes. His mother Leela, whose hands are knotted like old date palm roots, ties a ragged shawl tighter around her shoulders. Together, they step onto the soggy earth, where the ground smells of damp reeds, fermented fish, and the faint sting of copper from distant metalworkers. The river whispers a promise of fertility, even as a distant drumbeat of war rattles the horizon like a bad ringtone. With a wooden plow scarred by 100 seasons, Aram cuts a neat furrow that sighs under the weight of his labor. Leela follows, scattering barley kernels that clang against the soil like tiny cymbals in a percussion solo. The sun climbs, turning the sweat on Aram's brow into a salty river that runs straight into his eyes, forcing a chuckle as he wipes it away with the heel of his boot. Nearby, a goat bleats conspiratorially, as if protesting the new fashion trend of early morning seed spitting. Even the earth seems to grin, exhaling a rich, earthy perfume that mixes with the lingering scent of freshly baked flatbread from Leela's oven back home. By midday, the village square buzzes like a beehive, with traders hawking figs, copper bangles, and rumors that the king's men are auditioning for a remake of Game of Thrones, only with more sandals and fewer dragons. Children dart between the stalls, their feet kicking up dust that glitters like powdered gold under the sun. Elder Harun, the unofficial town historian, pauses his storytelling to warn that a bad harvest could turn the once plentiful floodplain into a soggy disaster movie set. Leela, ever the pragmatic, trades a handful of barley for a sack of dates, muttering that dates are the original energy bars, minus the questionable marketing hype. The community leans on the floodplain's generosity like a tired traveler on a rickety rope bridge, relieved, but always aware that one slip could send everyone plunging into the river's cold grin. As the shadows stretch, whispers of war drift in on the wind, carrying the metallic clang of distant armor and the sour taste of fear. Aram's father, who vanished years ago to fight a king's campaign, is spoken of in hushed tones, his name echoing like a half-remembered song. Leela clutches a worn amulet, its stone warm against her palm, a relic of an older covenant that the gods will protect sowers more than swordsmen. Yet the younger men gather at the riverbank, polishing spears that glint like bathroom fixtures, joking that they'd look better in a superhero movie than in a trench. The tension crackles, a silent thunder that threatens to drown the rhythmic beat of planting with the chaotic drum of conflict. When night finally drapes the valley in a blanket of indigo, fireflies flicker like tiny lanterns, and Aram lies on his back, staring up at constellations that have watched more harvests than any living soul. He feels the pulse of the earth beneath him, a slow, steady thrum that says, "We'll get another crop, even if the war tries to turn us into background extras." Leela hums an ancient lullaby, her voice rough as sandpaper, yet sweet enough to coax a reluctant mouse out of a grain sack. The floodplain, now quiet, seems to exhale, releasing a faint scent of tomorrow's wheat, promising that life will keep sowing its ridiculous, beautiful plot twists. And somewhere, a distant commander, scrolling through messengers like a medieval tick-tock, may realize that a field of barley beats a field of dead men any day. The sun climbs like a lazy dragon, spilling amber across the ridge, and Aram wipes the sweat from his brow as the midday heat rolls over the wheat fields. The air shimmers above the thatch-roofed huts, turning the horizon into a wavy mirage that makes every step feel like wading through soup. With calloused hands, he hoists his scythe, its blade catching the light like a metallic tongue ready to bite the stalks. Around him, neighbors, Myra with her spare hat, old Jafar nursing a cracked water jar, move in a rhythm older than the village's stone well. The only soundtrack is the rustle of golden ears and the distant bleat of goats, a soundtrack that says, "Welcome to the middle act of harvest." Mid-morning, a flicker of darkness darts across the tops, and a cloud of tiny green beetles erupts like a pop-up ad for a pest control app. Their chittering chorus burrows into the stalks, leaving a bitter, sour scent that makes Aram's nose curl like a cartoon skunk. The beetles swarm the youngest shoots, turning tender sprouts into a mushy mush of wilted disappointment. Aram slaps one free-handed, sending a rogue bug spiraling into the air, only to watch it crash into the hay like a poorly timed meme. Though the infestation threatens to rewrite their harvest script, the farmers scramble with wooden rakes and homemade sprays, shouting jokes to keep the panic at bay. As the infestation spreads, the village's informal task force, Beetle Busters, forms faster than an emergency hashtag trending on Twitter. Myra passes a bucket of brine to Jafar, who scoops it into a rusted tin and sprays it with the vigor of a cowboy in a spaghetti western. Aram, spotting a weary teen slumping, slides a freshly sliced melon under his arm, its sweet scent cutting through the sour stink of beetles. Laughter bubbles up when someone mimics the beetles' jittery dance, and even the stoic overseer cracks a grin that cracks his beard. In that shared toil, the heat feels less like an oppressor and more like a communal sauna, the kind where strangers become sweaty comrades. By afternoon, the sun's glare turns the field into a giant oven, and the workers' shirts cling like cling film on a Thanksgiving turkey. Aram's back aches with the stubborn dignity of a medieval knight who just discovered that armor is not, in fact, ergonomic. Jafar swears the beetles are secretly auditioning for a horror movie. The unbearable lightness of beetle-infested grain. And the crowd giggles despite the gnawing fatigue. A stray dog darts through the rows, snatching a fallen stalk and trotting away like a dog-eared paperback, prompting Aram to shout, "Hey, that's not the plot twist I'm looking for." Yet, even as the heat drips into their throats like syrup, each bite of water feels sweeter than a victory dance at a concert finale. As shadows stretch and the day sighs toward dusk, the beetles retreat, leaving behind a battlefield of dented stalks and a lingering taste of burnt earth. The villagers gather the salvaged grain, their hands stained with dust, sweat, and a few stubborn beetle shells that sparkle like misplaced sequins. Aram leans on his scythe, watching the last glint of sun melt into twilight, feeling the quiet pride that comes from surviving another ordinary storm. He shares a simple loaf with Myra, its crust crackling like applause, and they toast with mugs of sour milk, joking that the next harvest will need more drama, less beetles. In the hush of night, the fields breathe alive because of those unremarkable moments of grit, humor, and the tiny, stubborn kindnesses that keep the earth humming. The wheat stalks stand like tired soldiers, bowing under a sky that drags a load of leaden clouds. Sunlight bleeds weakly through the gloom, painting the fields in a pallid gold that feels more like old parchment than summer. Bees, the only buzzing gossip, have abandoned the blossoms, leaving a hushed hum that feels like a broken record stuck on a single note. Even the wind seems to hold its breath, as if waiting for someone, perhaps the gods, perhaps the next rain, to finally speak. In this waiting silence, Aram leans on his hoe, feeling the rough wood barked by sweat that tastes of rust and dust. The village wells gurgle like a tired old man trying to remember his own name, once full, now sputtering a pathetic trickle of muddy water. Children chase the mirage of a pond that shimmers only in their imagination, their laughter turning to whines that echo off cracked adobe walls. Mothers stir thin porridge that smells of burnt toast and desperation, while the smell of dried figs clings to the air like a stubborn perfume. Even the goats have taken a leave of absence, their hooves absent from the dusty paths, as if they'd enrolled in a silent protest against the heat. And all the while, the clouds argue among themselves, never committing to a drop, as if they were debating the plot of a slow burn Netflix series. Word spreads faster than a stray cat on a rooftop that the granaries might not survive the season. Old Joran, who once bartered chickens for gossip, whispers that the next harvest could be as barren as a tall, keen desert scene minus the dragons. Aram feels his heart thudding like a drumline in a marching band, each beat a reminder that his modest toil might dissolve into dust. He imagines his diligent sowing turning into a tragic meme when you work hard, but the universe hits pause, captioned over a wilted stalk. Yet, despite the looming specter of emptiness, he clutches his hoe like a lifeline, refusing to let the unremarkable moments slip away unnoticed. Elder Myra steps forward, her voice cracked like dried corn husks, and unspools a tale of the great drought of 3 generations ago. Back then, the fields turned to a desert that even camels refused to cross. But a sudden storm arrived, an angry sky that dumped water like confetti at a New Year's rave. She laughs, pointing out that the villagers then danced in the mud, slipping on slugs and singing songs about soggy socks, turning tragedy into a slapstick comedy. The elders chuckle, noting that the ancestors never invented Wi-Fi, yet managed to upload resilience straight into their marrow. Their stories taste of smoked meat and bitter tea, reminding Aram that history is a stubborn weed that refuses to be pulled out by fear. So the fields sit, waiting, as if the earth itself holds its breath for a punch line that never arrives. The silence is punctuated only by the occasional creak of a thrashing stone, a sound as dry as a dad joke at a family reunion. Aram wipes the grime from his cheek, feeling the grit of soil like a badge of honor, and whispers to the clouds, "Come on, deliver the sequel." Even if the rain decides to stay on vacation, the villagers have learned that a harvest is more than grain. It's the stubborn song they hum while the world snoozes. And in that ordinary waiting, there lies a quiet heroism, so unremarkable that it might just become legend. One grain at a time. When the first golden stalks finally bowed under the weight of summer, the village spilled into the fields like a tide of aprons and straw hats. The air smelled of sun-baked wheat, and the faint, sweet rot of beetles that had taken a vacation in the grain. Old Marta rattled a wooden fork, announcing the start of the harvest with a voice that could rival a town crier on a coffee high. Children darted between rows, their laughter snapping like dry corn kernels under a skillet. Even the village dog, Sir Barks-a-Lot, trotted proudly with a sack of hay strapped to his back, as if he were auditioning for a medieval farm boy movie. Just as the sickle sang its first arc, a low rumble rolled over the horizon, announcing a storm that looked like Mother Nature had swallowed a blender. Dark clouds churned, spilling ash-gray rain that hammered the thatched roofs into a frantic percussion. The wind ripped through the rows, snatching loose straw like a mischievous toddler stealing cookies. The scent of wet earth rose, mingling with the metallic tang of lightning that crackled so loudly the old miller's beard stood on end. Even the cows, usually stoic, mooed in protest, as if demanding a refund on their pasture subscription. The farmers didn't scatter. Instead, they huddled under a makeshift canopy of salvaged tarps, flashing grim smiles that said, "We've survived worse." Like that time, Aunt Leela tried to bake a sourdough with a goat's milk. Hands slipped on slick stalks, sending a cascade of wheat into the mud. A slapstick scene that would make Charlie Chaplin raise an eyebrow. Yet each slip was met with a hearty chuckle and a quick wipe of the grime. Because in this village, mud was just another seasoning. Young Tomas, wielding a rusted fork like a lightsaber, declared the storm a level -5 boss, and rallied the crew with a battle cry that echoed across the fields. The irony was delicious. The tempest that threatened to ruin the harvest ended up providing a free-flowing soundtrack of splashing rain and collective shouts. turning the day into a chaotic, muddy dance. With the storm finally passing, the sky cleared to a crisp, lemon-yellow light that made the wet wheat glisten like a field of polished coins. Together, the villagers slashed, tied, and stacked the grain, their muscles humming with the rhythm of an old folk song hummed by Mrs. Ng as she hauled a sack of seed husks. The collective effort turned the soggy mess into neat bundles, each bundle smelling of earthy triumph and the faint perfume of dried hay, like winning a gold medal for the least glamorous sport. Even the dog, Sir Barksalot, proudly carried a stray stalk in his teeth, strutting like a tiny, four-legged superhero in a caped cloak commercial. By sunset, the fields resembled a patchwork quilt of golden swaths, and the community shared crusty bread and bitter tea, laughing at how they'd survived a storm that could have been scripted by a disaster movie, but felt more like a sitcom episode. In the glow of the lanterns, the villagers toasted the day's quiet heroism, toasting with mugs that clinked louder than any triumphant fanfare. They realized that the true victory lay not in the bountiful grain, but in the way ordinary hands had turned panic into perseverance, a lesson as subtle as a ninja's footfall. As the moon rose, casting silver shadows over the empty rows, an old storyteller whispered that future historians would call this the great harvest of the unremarkable, like a sequel to a blockbuster that never existed. The crowd chuckled, recalling how their ancestors' epic saga was once reduced to a footnote about a rain-soaked barn, proof that history loves to hide its sparkle in the mundane. And so, with the night breeze rustling the leftover stalks, they went home, each carrying a quiet pride that would outshine any Hollywood climax. Because real heroism often wears a stained shirt and a smile. The sun sank low behind the ridge, spilling amber over the newly filled granaries like a giant golden pantry door. Villagers swarmed the courtyard, clapping hands and slapping backs, while the scent of fresh wheat mingled with the sour tang of spilled ale. Old Marta spun a tale about a harvest so bountiful it could have fed a small army, though the only fighting she'd seen was the children wrestling over the last loaf of barley bread. Laughter cracked like whips, and somewhere a lone piper tried to play Stairway to Heaven on his reed pipe, earning a chorus of good-natured boos. Yet the celebration felt as ordinary as a Netflix binge, comforting, familiar, and oddly heroic in its own low-key way. As the night stretched, the hum of the fires crackle stitched together the unremarkable moments that held the village together. Women knotted sacks of barley, while boys chased fireflies, their silhouettes flickering like low-budget special effects in an ancient cartoon. The clatter of wooden spoons against cauldrons was the soundtrack to a story no bard would ever write, but it kept the belly of the community full. Ironically, the most memorable part of the evening was the sigh of Aunt Livia as she realized she'd run out of clean aprons, proof that heroism often comes in the form of a laundry shortage. Even the village's stray dog, a shaggy mutt that looked like a cross between Chewbacca and a mop, found a spot on the haystack to snooze, contented as if he'd just won a Nobel Prize in napping. In the soft glow of the lingering embers, Aram beckoned the youngest, tiny Leela, with dirt under her nails, to sit on the old stone wall. He traced the grain's rhythm with a weathered finger, each tick of the stalk echoing the heartbeat of the season, as if the wheat itself were chanting a metronome. "Listen," he whispered. "The wind tells us when to sow and when to reap, just like your favorite streaming service tells you when a new episode drops." The child's eyes widened, the smell of sweet chaff rising like incense, while Aram's beard swayed like a tumbleweed caught in a gentle breeze. With each patient lesson, the old farmer turned the mundane cadence of harvest into a secret language, a lullaby that promised tomorrow's bread before sunrise. As darkness deepened, a hush settled over the courtyard, and the star-spattered sky seemed to lean in, listening to the quiet hope that rose with the smoke. Leela clutched a bundle of stalks, feeling the rough fibers bite her palm, a tactile reminder that future feasts would be built on these gritty hands. An owl hooted from the rafters, sounding oddly like a distant commentator announcing a game-changing play, while the villagers exchanged nods that said, "We got this." The mood was less a triumphant battle cry and more a whispered promise, as steady as a sitcom's closing theme that you know will play again next week. In that moment, the ordinary harvest became a quiet pact, sealing the season's rhythm with a hope so subtle it could have been missed by a dragon with short sight. When the last embers sputtered out, the villagers trudged home, carrying sacks that smelled of earth, sweat, and a hint of fermented hope. Aram lingered, polishing his axe with a rag that had seen more seasons than any royal decree, and chuckled that even the gods must have taken a day off for this. The path home was littered with stray kernels, the kind that stick to socks and make you hop like a cartoon character. A reminder that greatness often hides in the messy bits, yet every step echoed with the confidence that next year's grain would rise, because the rhythm had been taught, the stories shared, and the laughter stored like fresh yeast. And so the cycle closed, not with a thunderous fanfare, but with the gentle, unassuming sound of a village breathing together, ready for whatever the next season would throw at them.